Welcome back everybody. So today I want to get right to it. My mission is to try and get my fretboard routed for binding. Before I crack on with that, I do have to do just a little bit of squaring off and sanding just to get it to the point where I'm perfectly happy with it before we go ahead and do it. But through the magic of YouTube editing, I'll get that done in the next 10 seconds or so. So those of you who've been following my build so far, you will probably know that the neck has quite a lot of issues in that nothing is perfectly straight and true. I put that mostly down to the fact that I've been using a cheap table saw that's not very well set up. So for example, the binding strip that runs through the middle is not perfectly at 90 degrees to the axis of the fretboard, and I'm just trying to tweak that a little bit right now to marry it up a little bit more. It's not too important as long as the neck glues in okay, and as long as the fretboard is straight and true in of itself. As long as the bridge matches up to the plane of the fretboard, then I really shouldn't have too many problems. That's including the nut in there as well. But nevertheless, I just wanted to give it a little last minute tweak, get it a little bit more square than it currently is. I am risking fiddling with my neck pocket dimensions here as I go, but I'm just going to hope for the best on that front, and then we'll get right to that binding. So we want to route for binding on the fretboard. The fretboard is already glued to the neck, and the basic theory is we've got one of these cutters, a rebate cutter, where we can put different size bearings, guide bearings, along the top, and if I run this cutter along my neck, it will end up taking a few millimeters out the fretboard using the neck itself as a template. Now, because I got a bit carried away and radiused my fretboard already, that makes life very difficult, because the easiest way to do this would be to use the router table and put the neck this way up, face down, and run that along the router table with this bearing in, and that would be perfect. That would be the normal way to do it. But because I've radiused the fretboard would have a natural wobble on it if I tried to use it that way up, which would be no good for routing that binding. Any little wobble in the binding will be deadly apparent. So unfortunately I can't really do it this way up, because the router table won't extend high enough without fouling on the neck itself. I could use, if I really wanted to, I could jig something up whereby I basically put a wall on each side of it and use the router top down, handheld, just like I would do with a router with a neck pocket or something like that. But I'm going to see if I can effectively jig up something that makes the fretboard flat enough to put down on the table without any wobble. The best way to do that would be effectively to make some little radius blocks that match the fretboard, glue those on the bottom, and they would represent a nice sturdy surface that I could rest the fretboard on. Unfortunately, that would take a lot of time. I could cheat by going and buying a pre-made wooden radius block, cheap off eBay or something like that, and cutting it up. But that seems like a waste, and again that would take time. So instead, what I'm going to try and do is just tack on a couple of banding strips on the top of the fretboard to make two kind of, I don't know what you call them, 2 feet for the fretboard to stand on, and hopefully that should be stable enough to run that over the table. That's the plan anyway. So I'm going to just try and mock that up now and see what it looks like. Okay, so this is my little ingenious slash bad idea rig that I've mocked up, and all it basically is some binding strips on one side with a gap in the middle. I've got a meter rule actually running up the middle of it to keep them an equal distance apart, and the theory is if I lay my neck face down on those strips and make it so that visually I have an equal amount of the binding protruding on each side, then it should be nestled in the centre, and I should be able to effectively masking tape and super glue that onto that template and use that as a base to go through the router. I will, once I've glued it down, remove these banding strips so that I'm not actually wasting them in the router, although I may end up sacrificing the two in the middle. I just need to check really that when I put this in the centre it doesn't rock, and at the minute it does a little bit, so I think I'm going to have to spend a little bit more time with the radius block before I commit to routing that, unfortunately. Quick edit time again. Okay, so resting that on there now, it does not rock. It feels nice and solid at both ends, which is reassuring. Sometimes it just takes that little bit extra time to finesse things, but that does suggest that the camber over the fretboard's a little bit more even than it was, which is great. So now I just need to try and glue that in place on my template, and hopefully it will work as planned. Right, there's no accelerator on that, so I'm just going to let it dry for a bit. The next challenge that I have is setting up for the rebate itself. The cutter that I have, the minimum amount that it can take a cut off by is 3mm. It shouldn't take off any more than the 3mm it measures really as a router bit. The kerf shouldn't be any more, it should be quite accurate hopefully. But the challenge I have is that the banding strips I'm going to use, these ebony strips, are 2mm wide. And I'm also going to have a strip of maple veneer up the inside which measures about 0.6mm. So even with a little bit of padding, with a little bit of glue, that's not going to quite come to 3mm. If anything, we want the wood to stand a little bit proud, we want the banding to stand a little bit proud of the edge so that I can scrape it back by hand just to make sure it's nice and flush. We definitely don't want it to be smaller than the neck, that's for sure. So to get around that, I'm going to have to route away less than 3mm. So in order to do that, what I'm simply going to do is stick some veneer along the side of the fretboard to pad it out a little bit where the bearing's going to be running along, and if that is 0.6mm thick, then that should give me just a little bit to play with to route to the correct depth. Fingers crossed. Okay, well, it might not look pretty, it might look a bit crazy, but in theory that's ready for routing. Right, we're just about ready to go. The router table is set up. I think I've commented before that this router table, well, the router table itself's actually pretty good, but the router that's in it is not very good at all. It doesn't have any through bench adjustment or anything like that, so it's a bit of a nightmare to get set up for a precision job like this, but nevertheless that's ready to go. The eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed that I've clipped off the corners of the headstock just to stop the bearing fouling on it so I can get right to the end of the fretboard. Hopefully that should be okay. I've practiced the movement a couple of times. make sure we're not going to clip anything as we're in mid swing. I just need to put my safety equipment on and go for it, I think. So how did we get on? Well, good news on both sides. The routing seems to have worked very well, very cleanly, went through like butter. I had the router on full speed this time. It has not tore out the palm wood at all, which is great. I really wasn't expecting to get away with that. That's fantastic. Do ignore the unsightly white stuff, that will be sanded off pretty soon. Two things to note. One, which I was expecting, I did know I was going to get, when you get right to the nut end where the nut's actually going to sit, because my headstock was in the way, I've obviously followed that as if it was a template. Just need to take a chisel to the end of that just to make that flat, which is fine. We've had one small casualty. If we come right the way along to the end of the fretboard on the far side, well, on both sides actually, there's a tiny little chip on the corner there which already had a chip in it, and there's a bigger chip here on the far corner, which, as you can see, is just about meeting the end of the fretboard. Now that's probably chipped off because it's unsupported and it's hanging free in the air. My fretboard should be ending before that anyway, really. What I'll probably do, bearing in mind there's a strip of banding to go, or a strip of binding to go on the end of the fretboard, I'll just make the very start of that chip the point where I cut the fretboard off, and that should be lovely. So yeah, quite pleased with that. Couldn't really hope for it to go any better. So I'm just going to get started on those little tidy up jobs. The other thing I will have to do is, this will be my last opportunity to take a proper saw to the fret slots, so I'm just going to go along all of those and make sure they're deep enough now as well, and then we can look at gluing on some binding. I have already just tested the binding up against the route, by the way, and I can confirm in all places it ranges from exactly flush to probably about 0.2 of a millimetre, so we got it just where we wanted it to be. Any deeper and that route would have been too much, and I would have had to kind of sand back the neck a little bit to meet to it, but thankfully it's perfect. Onward. Alright, so the fretboard's just about ready for binding. There are a couple of things to note. One of which is that normally if this was a PRS or a Gibson style guitar, which is the kind of guitar you would generally put binding on out of the big three, the nut normally rests on the actual neck wood itself. It does not rest on the fretboard, and it's quite a tall nut. In this build I'm actually leaving a little shelf on the end of the fretboard to stand the nut on to give it a little bit of extra height. So the binding is actually going to effectively sort of go alongside where the nut should be, but the nut is the full width of the neck. So I'm effectively going to have to carve into the binding to make that shelf to put the nut on, which you wouldn't normally have to do. It will look okay though, because the binding is the same colour as the fretboard. It's all ebony, so it won't look too ridiculous when I do that. It's a black nut as well. Also, this end of the fretboard I have chopped off. It's not the neatest underneath. I did etch into the neck wood a little bit, but you won't really see that because it will be covered by the binding. What I'll probably do is I'll get the binding all stuck on, and then we'll look at maybe just putting a slight curve with the detail files on the end there, just to neaten it up a little bit. The other thing as well, with pretty much everything in this build, because I am learning, one of the main things I've got wrong throughout is the order in which I do things. You saw, because that was the reason I had to use all that jig and everything to get this through the router table in the first place. One thing I probably should have done before even putting the fretboard on was to actually shape the headstock. I intentionally left the headstock unshaped for now, just because it meant I knew I was going to be keeping it for months and months and months in cupboards and things like that, and it just meant there was a little bit of extra wood on the edge, so that if the edge got damaged, then it didn't matter, because it was a bit that I was going to chop off anyway. But if you can imagine, at the moment the wood is going right the way up to the nut. A normal headstock shape will, you know, come somewhere around here, removing all this piece of wood. Now if I go ahead and put the banding on, by the way, I'm calling it banding because the wood that I am using to do the binding is referred to as banding when it's bought, because it's actually wood that's used to go around the outside of acoustic guitars, and that's referred to as banding. So it is banding that I'm applying as binding, if that makes sense. So if I use those two words interchangeably, just ignore me. But anyway, yeah, if I apply the binding as it is now, it's going to be right up against this wood that I'm later going to have to remove. So it'll get quite hairy, I think, getting up to the binding, probably with the bobbin sander, but I'm quite confident that I can do that and make it look absolutely fine. If I was set up down the workshop right now with all my tools ready to go, I would stop what I was doing right now, reshape the headstock, and then carry on with the binding. But because that would involve me probably going away, coming back another day, having to set the bobbin sander up and all the rest of it, it's nice just to get this job finished off in the meantime, even though I know it's going to create a little bit more work for me in the future. But that's kind of the theme of this build anyway, isn't it? So let's get the binding stuck on. So as I've already said, I'm going to use some of this maple veneer in conjunction with the ebony binding, and what that'll mean is I'll just get a nice little thin white strip in between the binding and the fretboard, just to accent it nicely up the side there. In order to glue that on, what you would normally do to clamp it, because you kind of want downward and inward pressure, you would use tape wrapped around it. Because I'm going to use tape wrapped around it, I can't have excess maple stuck up way past the height of the binding, because it'll get in the way of the tape, and then if you try and tape down on top of it, it'll just pull the binding off, and that's no good. So if anything, I want the binding, well, possibly even slightly smaller than the ebony. However, we don't have a lot of room to play with. That ebony is, the nut end at least, probably less than 1 millimetre taller than the actual fretboard. So I'm going to have to just aim to get the maple the same height as the ebony before I stick it on. So I'm going to try and mark that up to cut it now. It's easy enough to cut, you can just use a scalpel to cut it, but marking up a long piece like this accurately could be tricky. I did consider gluing the ebony to the maple first to make this a little bit easier, but I have it on good authority I should get away with it. There's no reason why I couldn't really. I've got plenty of excess maple to try again should I cut it too small. Alright, so we're ready to actually apply the banding. Now, in this instance, all the binding that I'm using is actually wood, so I've opted to use wood glue. The only thing I've got to be a little bit wary of is I can't really apply lots of clamping pressure, therefore I need to use the minimal amount of glue possible really. So in order to do that, I'm going to use a paintbrush. So there we have it. Might look a little bit messy at the moment, obviously, all taped up there with the excess glue seeping out, but I'm very confident that when we come back tomorrow and scrape off the excess, that should look very tidy indeed. A few things to note from this build. As I think I've already mentioned, the running order of things has been a bit wrong in the way that I've done things, and it kind of draws to attention how important it is to do things in the right order. I definitely think in future that you should start off by shaping the neck blank, get that headstock angle in there, put a veneer on the headstock if you're going to do that, then put the fretboard on, then bind it, then put the radius in. That just seems like the sensible way to do it really, but that just happens to be the order I've ended up doing things in. Not to worry. So as I say, we'll come back next time and we'll clean that binding up and take a look. If you want to see what that turns out like, come back and watch the next video. Until next time, goodbye.